Playground should be an enjoyable place where children and parents don't have to worry about safety. However, that's not always the case. A child's safety can be maximized through some simple and common sense strategies, such as picking up trash and debris or removing broken equipment. Even using something as simple as a ruler to measure the depth of loose fill could be very important in the event of a fall. There are occasions when specific tools are required to ensure play equipment is safe, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. In order to check the overall safety of playground structures, as it pertains to entrapment and entanglement, we use gauges and probes. You may have seen these tools in your office or in use by another inspector and wondered, how do I actually use these? While at first glance, these steps may appear a bit complicated, but after today's demonstrations, you'll be using probes and gauges with ease in no time at all. The playground that we'll be regulating or see in a public park are sized according to the age of the children that will be using the equipment. There are 3 categories of playgrounds: toddler, preschool, and school-age. The playground we are using today is for school-age children, but the tools and tests demonstrated today will be identical on all 3 playgrounds. The first set of tools I'm going to talk about are the projection gauges. Use these to determine if something like a nut, a bolt, or a piece of equipment is sticking out in a way that could entangle a child's clothing or impale or puncture a part of a child's body. Anything extending outward from a surface is called a projection and requires testing with the gauges. If a projection fails the test I'm going to demonstrate, it becomes a protrusion and requires further testing. There are 4 sizes of projection gauges. The first is a relatively small gauge and is used to measure a projection that could extend out far enough to penetrate the skull and cause a major injury to a child. The second gauge I'll demonstrate is a little bit larger and simulates a child's eye socket. Any projection that extends past this gauge could seriously injure a child's eye. The third and largest gauge is used to test any projection that extends out in a way that could damage a child's internal organs if the child should fall or run into the protrusion. The fourth and final gauge is very thin at only 1/8 of an inch thick and is used in very specific circumstances when evaluating protrusions and entanglements. Let's try this first set of tools on the playground. Here's 2 bolts sticking out of the surface of the playground. These would be projections, so we need to test them to see if the projections also are protrusions and fail the gauge test. Starting with the smallest gauge first, we place the gauge over the bolt and notice that the face of the bolt does not extend past the face of the gauge, so this would be a pass. However, because this does not go all the way to the back of the surface, we also need to test with the next larger gauge. Placing it over the bolt does not extend past the face of the gauge, so this would be a pass. Let's take a look at this second bolt. One thing that's worth noting at this point is that in addition to a child being able to somehow impale themselves on these projections, there's another danger of projections that are considered to be protrusions, and that is the entanglement issue. If a child were on top of this surface and their shoelace was dangling down and they went to jump to this ladder right here and somehow their shoelace caught on this, I can't get this off no matter how hard I pull. So this would be a serious entanglement hazard and could cause injury to the child as they toppled over. That's why it's very important to think about projections in terms of the gauges and in terms of an entanglement hazard. So let's try our gauges on this. Taking the smallest gauge first, we place it over the bolt and notice 2 things. The bolt extends past the face of the gauge, so it fails this gauge. However, it does not go all the way back to the surface, so we would also need to take a look at it with the next larger gauge as well. Placing that gauge over the bolt, it extends past the face of the gauge as well, So this particular projection is a protrusion, fails both of the tests, and needs to be addressed further. One area that's often overlooked on playgrounds is the underside of the composite structure. Let's go underneath and take a look at that. I'm underneath one of the raised platforms on this composite structure, looking to see if there's any projections underneath here that could injure a child should they stand up quickly and hit up against it. Looking around, looks pretty good under here. I do see a bolt here that might be suspicious. Let's test it. Starting with the smallest gauge first, I'm going to place the gauge over, and the bolt does not extend through the face of this gauge. However, there's still some space behind this gauge and the surface, so I need to go to the larger gauge. Placing it over, it does fit flat against the surface, and the bolt does not extend past the face of the gauge, so this would be a pass. Also remember, you can have no more than 2 threads of the bolt extending past the nut. I don't see anything else under here that looks like it could be a hazard. So let's head up to the top of the composite structure and take a look at a demonstration of the largest of the projection gauges. We've looked at the smaller projection gauges and seen how each one is used. Now let's take a look at the circumstances in which we would use the largest of the gauges. This gauge is used to determine whether any projection, as we have here, could pose a hazard that could actually impale a child or damage internal organs should they fall against it. If a child were standing on this bar right here and slipped, they might come down very hard against this projection, and it could cause serious injury to the child. So to test with this gauge, we would place it on top of the projection like so. And in this circumstance, we don't need to worry about whether the projection goes past the gauge face because it doesn't fit over the projection at all. So this would not be considered a safety hazard. Let's move on to the slide. Slides are a unique piece of equipment in that they present a serious entanglement hazard. Imagine a child coming down the slide. There's some sort of a protrusion on the side of this slide, and a piece of their clothing were to get caught on it. Could be a hoodie drawstring, a necklace of some sort. If it were to get caught on that protrusion, the child would essentially be hanging by that piece of clothing. Could be very, very serious injury for the child. So we need to test slides very, very carefully. In addition to using the 3 gauges that we've already shown you, we would also need to use this very thin 1/8 inch gauge. To do this, there's an imaginary zone that extends 21 inches out from the side of the slide bed, from the very bottom all the way to the top and the platform where they would enter the slide. This zone goes up 42 inches as well. So this area on both sides of the slide and this area at the top would need to be free of any projections that would fail the test and become protrusions. In looking at this slide, there are no projections that need to be tested, so this slide would pass. We've got one more piece of equipment to test, and that's the swing set. Let's go over there now. Due to the potential for impact injuries, swing sets can be extremely dangerous for children. Imagine a child on the swing, they're swinging forward, and another child comes running up underneath. Anything extending out from the bottom of this swing seat could be extremely dangerous and could hurt the child if they should run up underneath it. So we need to test the swing seat using our 1/8 inch thin gauge. Now the first thing that we're always going to do is look for any sort of worn connectors or cracks in the swing seat itself. Having done that, we would flip the seat over and look for any projections on the underside of the swing. We have 3 rivets here that look like they need to be tested. Placing the 1/8 inch gauge over the rivet like so, I can see that it does fit over. However, the rivet does not stick past the face of the gauge, so this would be considered a pass, and this swing seat would not be a potential hazard. We've looked at the different gauges and identified how each can be used in order to look for protrusion hazards on the playground. Now let's turn our attention to the probes. Probes are used to check for entrapment hazards. Entrapment hazards occur anytime a child's body or head could become stuck on a piece of playground equipment. We're going to need two probes in order to test for entrapment hazards. The first probe represents the torso or body of one of the smallest children that would be using this piece of playground equipment. On the other hand, the larger probe represents the head size of one of the largest children that would be using the playground equipment. So having the smallest body and the largest head means that we're going to protect a large majority of the children that would be on this composite structure or any of the playground equipment here. We're going to use these probes in order to test for bound openings. A bound opening occurs anytime there's an opening that is closed in on all four sides like we have here. To illustrate the dangers of a bound opening, I'm going to ask for the help of my assistant Blue. As you can see, Blue's not a child, but he's graciously agreed to help me illustrate how important it is to check all the bound openings on a playground. Should Blue be up here on this composite structure and decide that he wants to get down to the bottom to see his friends, he might jump off using this crazy ladder to climb down, and if his feet were to slip and go through the opening, Blue could get stuck and he would basically be dangling here from this opening. It's easy to see how dangerous this could be for Blue. All right, let's remove him from the opening. Thank you, Blue, for your help. And let's actually test the openings using our probes. Again, I'll use this bound opening here, which is closed in on all four sides. I always start with the smallest probe first, and I place it through the opening. Notice this represents the child's body being able to pass through the opening. This wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for the fact that children have a much larger head than they do a body. So if this goes through the opening, I must also ensure that the larger head probe will go through as well. As I put the head probe through the opening, notice it passes through with no problem, so this opening would be considered a pass. It would not be an entrapment hazard. Now, bound openings come in a variety of different sizes, configurations, and shapes, and we need to test for all of them. Notice right here, I have several bound openings. This one right here is closed in on all four sides. This one is too, and even the space between this bar and this post is a bound opening as well. So again, starting with the smaller of the two probes, I would place it in these openings, and no matter which orientation I place it in, it will not fit through, so this means that the child's body could not get through this opening, and so I don't need to worry about testing with the larger head probe. Let's take a quick look at an opening that would fail the entrapment test. Here we have a bound opening, closed in on all four sides. Remember, we start with the small probe first, placing it through the opening. It passes through, which means the child's body could go through the opening. So I need to test with the larger one. As I attempt to place it through the opening, it will not fit through. This means that this bound opening would fail the test and would be considered an entrapment hazard. Now let's head over to the swing set and take a look at flexible bound openings. The bucket swing is a type of flexible opening. Notice that although I can't move it much, I can alter or distort this opening by the use of pressure. So it needs to be tested as a flexible bound opening. The difference in a, let me get this in position, the difference in a flexible opening is that when I test, I have to be able to push the probe, whether it's the torso or the head probe, through the opening using a required amount of force. If this were on a toddler playground, it would be 30 pounds of force. On a preschool or school-age playground, it would be 50 pounds of force. So taking the torso probe, which I always start with, I try to push it through the opening using the 50 pounds of force because this is on a school-age playground. No matter which orientation I place it in or how much force I use, I can't get the torso probe to go through the opening. So this means that a child's body can't pass through the opening, and I don't need to test with the head probe as well. So this flexible opening on this seat passes. Let's go take a look at another type of flexible opening. Here we have a chain climber. Like the bucket swing we saw earlier, these are flexible bound openings. The difference here being that these openings could be altered or distorted by a separate child using the equipment or a child falling through the opening and getting stuck as they go through. So these need to be tested with our probes. The difference being that when we use our probes, we would need to be able to get both of the probes through using 30 pounds of pressure for a toddler playground or 50 pounds of pressure for a preschool or school-age playground. Remember, we always start with the smallest probe first and pushing it through the opening. It goes through easily. So that means we would need to test with the larger head probe as well. Remember, we would be able to use up to 50 pounds on this school-age playground in order to get this probe to go through. In this case, it goes through easily, so this would be a pass. But you might imagine a circumstance in which this opening could be altered in such a way that this would not go through even with the 50 pounds of pressure, which would be a fail. There's one more set of circumstances I want everybody to be aware of concerning bound openings. Let's go check that out now. We've talked about a variety of bound openings. Let's take a look at one last example. Notice this opening here would be a bound opening. A side here, here, here. The ground would make up the fourth side of the opening. So this would need to be tested. Starting with the torso probe, extending it through the opening, we see that it does go through, so we'd need to also test with the larger head probe. Taking that probe, notice that no matter how I try to move it, I can't fit it through the opening, so this looks like it would be a fail. However, any opening in which the ground makes up the fourth side is exempt from the probe test that I've demonstrated today. That's because if a child were to get themselves stuck in here in some way, it would be very easy for someone to dig out the excess material so that the child could extricate himself, and then he could go through with no problem. So we've taken a look at all of the different examples of bound openings. Let's take a look now at the partially bound openings. If you'll follow me up to the top of the composite structure, we'll check those out. The last probe in our toolkit is called the fish probe. It's called the fish probe because it looks a little bit like a fish. This section is used to represent the child's head, and this section to represent the child's neck. We use this to test for partially bound openings. Partially bound opening is defined as any opening on the playground, such as a U-shaped or a V-shaped opening, in which one of the sides of the opening is not closed in. Let me use my assistant Blue to show you how dangerous a partially bound opening could be. If Blue were on the playground and he were to decide to talk to one of his friends down below, he could stick his head through the opening here to talk, and when he was through, there would be no problem for him to pull his head back through, so this would not be considered an entrapment hazard. However, if we do the same movement using Blue on this narrower opening, notice that Blue could get his neck through to talk to his friends, but now he's stuck and he's hanging here. This would be a choking hazard for Blue and would be extremely dangerous. Thank you for your help, Blue. Now let's do the same test using our fish probe. Here's my two openings right here. They're both partially bound, closed on three sides, open at the top. This one's a little wider. Let's try this one first. I take the fish probe and I put it parallel to the opening and I insert it down. The goal is to see if there's any point in this opening in which both sides of the fish probe touch both legs of the opening at the same time. As I drop it down, I can get all the way to the bottom and neither side touches the sides of the opening. So this opening would not be an entrapment hazard. Let's try the same test on this narrower opening. Again, I start with the fish probe, parallel with the opening. As I drop this one down, I can see that it touches both sides of the opening right here. So I'd need to do further testing. I would mark the spot where they touch, then turning the fish probe on its side, I insert it back into the opening to the point at which it was touched both sides, and notice that right here, the neck is in, but the head cannot come back through. So this would be considered a fail and would need further attention. When evaluating risk to children in out-of-home care, playground safety is extremely important. The techniques you've seen today can be found in the CPSC Handbook for Public Playground Safety under Appendix B, Playground Testing. If you have any additional questions about using probes or gauges, you can always contact your trainer or your supervisor. Thank you for participating in playground safety training, and thank you for the important job you do protecting children each and every day.